Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker. And today I have a special treat for you guys. So we have a special guest here who's coming on board. First of all, I'll introduce my Christian co-host, David Russell is helping me out. Hey, David.
Hey, buddy, how you doing?
Excellent. The audience is definitely familiar with you. But also in terms of the guest, you've been on the show before. So we have Dr. Cheryl White. Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, Dale, thanks for having me back.
Excellent. Yeah, I remember you were on the show with Hugh Ferry on the Shroud of Turin there a few months ago. And
Yes, I was.
so today this is kind of up your alley. We're going to be talking about sort of the authenticity and historicity of relics, which is interesting for me because, and I think for David Russell as well, we're both Protestants, so we know nothing about it. So it'll be an education for us there.
Well, Dale, I am a relic hunter. They call me a relic hunter sometimes because I actually used to go and dig for artifacts in like the area I'm at. I'm in Virginia. So there's a lot of Civil War and Revolutionary War stuff here. And I've actually been able to dig up bullets and other little things that were around here. But yeah, I don't know nothing about the what we're talking about here, but I do like to relic hunt as far as history goes. It's really neat.
Awesome. I didn't know that. So yeah, that's really cool. You have some kind of background in relic hunting there. So.
Right, yeah, just metal detectors, man. Just cheapo metal detectors. nothing quite on the archaeological level like that,
Gotcha. All right, cool. So yeah, with that said, the first thing I want to do is just for the audience members that didn't see you on the Shroud Show, Cheryl, do you want to maybe take some time and just kind of give us an introduction as to who you are and maybe why relics? Why is that an area of expertise for you?
Okay, sure. So I'm a professor of history at Louisiana State University in Shreveport, and my primary field of concentration is late medieval and early modern Europe. But I also did a field in Christian church history, so I'm super interested particularly in social expressions of religiosity that you find in the Middle Ages. It's really a fascinating period to look at the patterns of personal piety and how obviously the Catholic practice of the veneration of relics has a rich and beautiful history. And so that's sort of what brings me to this. And you'll recall that on the program that you did on the Shroud, I also talked about that it was really my interest in relics and the cult of relics and practice of personal piety that brought me to know the Shroud a long time ago. So.
Awesome. All right, cool. All right, so I guess the first thing getting started then is, okay, what exactly is a relic? And maybe what are the criteria whereby something gets labeled as an official relic in like an official sense? And how does that work? You mentioned within the Catholic Church. What about other denominations or, like Eastern Orthodox and that sort of thing? Are there differences or similarities there?
Well, remember that Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy were one church for the first 1,000 years. And so we share this great, rich tradition that originates in I suppose the earliest record of a martyrdom and the veneration of relics that we have goes to the year 155 with the martyrdom of St. Polycarp of Smyrna. And we know that his remains were venerated by the faithful as soon as he was dead. And so we have a very rich early account of that. We know that this was a common practice among early Christians. So I wouldn't say that our practice or belief in any way differs between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism because we share that same early root of this practice. But a relic essentially it's very simple. I mean, the word simply means something left behind. So as David was talking about hunting relics, what he's talking about really are, of course, historical artifacts. And relics, in the strictest sense of the word, the religious sense of the word, are those physical remains that are left behind or somehow, there's those classes of relics, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but that are somehow associated with the life of a particularly holy person. So that's what I'm here to talk about today is this practice of the veneration of relics and where that comes from.
Awesome. And David, do you have any follow-up questions of like a sort of clarification nature on that front, or?
Yeah, like what is by veneration of relics? And is it akin to like idol worship in any way?
Okay, great question. That's a super question. And no, of course it's not. It is if you look at the root of the word venerate, venerare, venerable, it's a word in Latin that means honor. So in the long tradition of Christianity, there have been two different words used. There is adorare in the Latin, which is to adore, and that is worship. It is reserved only for God. Veneration, honor, is reserved for holy people. We can honor people who have come before us, Christians who have come before us, without worshiping them. And in fact, to worship a saint is not only an aberration of practice, it goes against the teachings of historical Christianity.
Right. Yeah. So Dale, I'll kick it back to you. I mean, that was I mean, well, there is one thing I kind of have on my mind is why is this like practice of like venerating things like I know they did it with Lazarus, right? They took him out of the tomb once they found it, and then I guess like they encased some of it stuff. So why is it just like I just want to know like why is it so important to them to like, you know, do stuff like that?
So remember that Christianity has as its foundational doctrine, if we can start here, I think it begins to have more clarity. The foundational doctrine of Christianity, upon which all other teachings are built, is something called the Incarnation. Christians believe that God became a man. And when God became a man, he fully fused himself with all of his creation. So all of his creation is imbued with God's grace. I mean, that is Christianity 101. We don't believe that created matter is evil. We believe it is good. So among the earliest Christians who had this understanding of the incarnation, for someone who had lived a particularly holy life or was an example of sanctity, someone they saw as a model, that the practice began of honoring their remains as a conduit, really as a conduit to connect spiritually and intellectually, emotionally with a physical remain. And when you think about it, so much of what Christianity does in its sacramental life draws upon physical elements: water for baptism, bread and wine for the Eucharist, oils for anointing of the sick. I mean, there is a physical component to the metaphysical aspect of our faith. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it certainly is an incarnational kind of theology.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting because you know today we're like, you know, just respect the dead, let them rest. You know, it's like totally different mindset there.
It is a completely different mindset. It's a completely different mindset. And as a matter of fact, you know, there's a kind of a running joke among the Catholics and Orthodox, among even the laity, that, you know, we just take people's bones and spread them all over the world. And it's not and it's actually not a matter of disrespect at all. It's a matter of it's a way of honoring them by making their model, their witness, more visible in Christian communities.
Wow, that's interesting. Dale, I'll kick it back to you, man. That's pretty much what I wanted to follow up with real quick.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, my sort of follow up on this, it's kind of touching upon a theological issue and that sort of thing. I've heard some Protestants take issue with the veneration of relics or just images and that sort of thing. Like I think it's called latria versus dulia worship.
Right.
Those are the
right.
Okay, so
again. Yeah.
Do you want
an issue
sort of
honoring versus adoring, honoring versus worship. They're two different things, which is why we use the word venerate.
Gotcha. Okay. And from my understanding, are there like 3 types of worship in the Catholic Church or something?
Three types of worship? No.
Okay.
There is Mass, which is our highest form of prayer.
Gotcha. Okay. No problem then. I think that's just that was talking about the latria versus dulia versus hyperdulia, I think is what.
Right.
Gotcha.
There is a hierarchy of sorts with regard to to even the veneration. For instance, the Blessed Virgin Mary is going to be at a greater level of veneration than, say, someone who is in the canonization process. So yeah, there is that. And obviously, the apostles and the martyrs of the early church have a special place of reverence, and it's even reflected in the church calendar. The liturgical calendar that developed very early in the church reflects already Marian feasts that are being celebrated by the third and fourth centuries, and the marking the days of the apostles, the martyrdom, the witness of the apostles. So that's even reflected. That hierarchy is reflected in the way the church calendar is structured.
Gotcha. All right, awesome. All right.
I got something on Dale on veneration here and stuff like that, since we're talking about veneration.
Sure.
And I've never blamed Catholics for worshiping this and worship. I understood veneration because I took a Christianity 101 history course, And, but there are some things that, from the perspective I took, that maybe you can confirm, that the reason that the Catholics were decided to ask them to intercede, I think that's a big issue, was because of certain corruption in the Dark Ages. And they felt like, hey, I can pray to this saint and confess to this saint, because I can't trust my priest at this time, because he's gonna, tell the king or something like that. So that's kind of like how we learned it, and that's a brief summary. But does that make sense? Does that follow a bit?
Let me just say that I think across the centuries, and this is particularly true of the Middle Ages, which is why I find them so fascinating, is that there have been abuses of practice. That does not mean that the doctrine itself is wrong because someone abuses the practice. So to ask a saint to intercede for me is the same thing, intercession, the same thing as prayer. It's the same thing as me calling up a friend of mine who is living in the physical world and say, hey, I've got this problem, this dilemma. I really need some prayer. Would you pray for me? It's interesting to me that many in the Protestant tradition don't think twice about that. But there's something somehow weird about asking someone who is in the church triumphant and who is right here with us in the great, cloud of witnesses, to ask someone who has already passed into that church triumphant to pray for me. That somehow that's a corruption of I don't know what, I can't get in the mindset of Protestants sometimes, but I will say this, that if you believe that death, physical death, is not an end but a beginning, they are more alive than we are. And I like the idea of having someone in that realm praying for me. Just to pray for me. I don't expect them to obtain the result. Only God does that. But to have a friend praying for me, wow. What's the difference?
Sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I guess for Protestants, we believe that, the only mediator we have is Jesus. That's why we go to him instead. And that's
exactly
ingrained
right.
in our mind. That's ingrained.
No. You are exactly right. And that is again, Christianity 101, as you said, that is core Christian teaching. If I'm asking a saint to intercede for me, I'm not asking them to be my mediator. I'm asking them to pray for me. And that's the same thing as I would call up a friend. If I call you up and say, David, would you pray for me today?
Yeah,
How is that any different? Yeah.
It's interesting. Dale, I'll kick it back to you, man.
Yeah, I just want to, so kind of changing gears, I want to bring up both a mutual friend of mine and David's, Caleb Jackson. And Cheryl, you'll remember him. He was my co-host in the Shroud Show that you were on.
Right.
And he's really interested in studying like miracles and that sort of thing. So I know sometimes miracles are associated with certain relics and that. So I just wanted to ask you about, do you know of any kind of documented miracle cases associated with relics that are interesting and perhaps that you find compelling as kind of evidence? And yeah, do you mind just sort of providing us some details of those?
Well, sure. I mean, and there's too many really to mention. I mean, the church is replete with examples of this going back to the earliest centuries, and we have the testimony of the early fathers themselves, who write about, particularly, this is interesting, Saint Jerome in the 4th century, who you may know was he's one of what we call the 4 great Latin doctors. He is the one who translated the scriptures into Latin. Before the canon of scripture was even closed, by the way, before there was a Bible, the fathers were translating the scriptures. And he wrote a beautiful treatise on the veneration of relics. And again, keep in mind, again, this is 4th century. So if you're trying to reach back to the primitive church and trying to reach back to what the earliest Christians did, he's writing a letter actually to a priest, or actually it's about a priest named Vigilantius, of all names, who is saying that the veneration of relics is wrong. And Saint Jerome corrects him pretty harshly by pointing to the great tradition of the church, as he calls it. And he says that miracles are wrought at the tombs of the saints all the time. He speaks about this as if it is a common event. And so if you were to go and read the hagiography, the lives of the saints, you would find that. Obviously, since the 16th century, when the current method was adopted, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome, actually there's 2 ways. Before that point in time, it could be a diocesan bishop who would appoint a commission and determine who was worthy of veneration. After that, it became the exclusive domain of a Vatican congregation, a Vatican bureaucracy, and which is the method that's used today. So in that process today, there's a miracle that's required for beatification, which is the step before saint, and there's obviously a miracle required for canonization. So there are some recent cases, of course, recent saints, Mother Teresa, for instance, who is now a saint. There have been, I believe, 2 or 3 miracles attributed to her. Pope St. John Paul II is the same thing. I mean, you can literally just go and read the lives of the saints and find it throughout history, because it is a requirement to be a saint. There has to have been a miracle associated with you, or you must have been a martyr for the faith.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so there's that requirement in order to be a saint, and then
Right.
your remains become a relic or that sort of thing. I was also curious about, like, do you know of any miracles associated, so not during the lifetime of the saint, but like associated with the relics themselves, like after the fact?
I mean, again, there are many. I mean, you can literally pick up any book of the lives of the saints, and you will find them throughout church history, that there are miracles attributed to their intercession. Not that they performed the miracle, but that it was through their intercession that God granted a miracle. Okay, I think that's a very important distinction. It is not the saint who performs the miracle. It is God who performs the miracle. And remember that, just like I think in the gospel accounts, we have all of these miracles of Jesus. Think about the apostles living with him, and seeing them every day, seeing these incredible things every day. And they still had trouble believing, didn't they? At the end, they still struggled with that. So these things are meant to be, miracles are meant to be for our edification, for our growth, for strengthening our faith. And I think God does that through a lot of ways. Working the miracles through his saints is, again, a longstanding 2,000-year tradition now in our church. So yeah, I mean, I can't tell you at this moment in time. I can't pick out one specific story and tell you, because I know there are so many. There are just so many.
Gotcha. Okay. I have one follow-up, and then I know David wanted to come in. I saw him on mute there. So
okay.
Just before I turn it to David, so without pointing to like specific cases, just in terms of methodology, I'm interested, because I know, for example, with miracle sites, Catholics have very rigorous criteria for authenticating. They don't just accept all of them. They only take a small subset. Is there something similar with the miracles associated with relics? Like, what's the methodology they use to authenticate it?
Yeah, any miracle that is going to be attributed, that rightly attributed, the church is very rigorous. I like the use of that word because there's obviously an entire bureaucracy of the church that is dedicated to the investigation of such things. In order to be a miracle, I mean, there are certain criteria that apply. One of them is that there must be no physical natural explanation for what has occurred. And I don't mean that this is you go to the doctor and you get a cancer diagnosis and you have a 5% chance of living and you recover. That's not a miracle. A miracle would be to go to the doctor and have a 0% chance of recovering. There must be, in the absence of any physical natural explanation, that is the overarching criteria for a miracle. They are by their nature a suspension of the natural law, a suspension of our human expectation. They are things that are outside of ordinary human experience. So that's the greatest criteria for that. It cannot be something that is attributed to or could be attributed to any other physical means, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Yeah, cool. So David, do you have any follow-up questions about this topic?
No, I was just looking for clarity because the way you asked the question, Dale, kind of it may or may not be clear, I think,
Okay.
at least from my perspective, that there's a difference between miracles associated with, like, let's say, the dry bones, right?
Right.
or versus what you're talking about, Dale. So are you talking about, like, some of these relics contain miracle properties of some sort?
No.
Okay.
It is not relics that it is not anything physical that brings about a miracle. It is God that brings about a miracle. And if someone, as a practice of their faith, is asking for a miracle and receives a miracle, and it is through the intercession of a saint, then the church will often attribute that miracle to the intercession of the saint. But it's not anything about the relic itself. It is always God working, always God. And see, this is where I think there is a disconnect between the traditional kind of historical understanding and what happened as a result of the Protestant movement. If you guys don't mind, could I speak to that for just a minute? Because I do think,
go for it.
Absolutely.
I do think that's super important. That what happened at the time of the Protestant movement, at the beginning of the 16th century, is there was such an abuse in the practice of relics, not so much in the veneration of them, but the abuse of the it was a wholesale trade in relics. I mean, there's no way to get around it. After the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 required that every church that was consecrated had to have a relic of a saint in its altar, what began to happen is that the demand probably kind of outstripped the supply at some point, and we began to see this abuse, corruption in the church that was pretty obvious. And I don't think there's any way around it. I mean, I think we have to confront that reality. So what happened as a result of that is that the Protestant movement, in many ways, looked at everything in the church that was a corruption of practice. I'll be very clear about this. That was a corruption of practice, and kind of tossed it out with the bathwater, for lack of a better analogy, rather than looking at the doctrine, the teaching, where it came from in the earliest church and theology behind it. The practice itself was deemed to be corrupt, and so the whole thing was tossed out. A true reform would have gotten to the root of the teaching, which is very beautiful. It's incarnational. So this is what I think happened, is that the Protestant movement took this turn. So we are now, 500 years into the future, and we have generations and generations and generations and 30-something thousand different Protestant sects that don't understand there's a difference between a corruption in the practice and a corruption in the teaching. The teaching is not wrong, but people abuse the practice. So to say that somehow a relic has magical powers or it brings about a miracle is just wrong. The church has never taught that. It is a way to honor the holiness of someone And in the process of doing that, if you ask them to help you, ask them to intercede for you, it is a conduit to God, and God alone works miracles. So I don't know if that helps clear that up. I mean, I feel like that's probably the subject of a whole other podcast.
Yeah, well, no, it does, because people are going to ask that. They're going to ask
Sure.
about that stuff because people will hold a rabbit's foot and ask for its luck properties to get a hold, and some people did trade in relics, some dukes and stuff like that, to gain an advantage, supernatural advantage. We also have cases of even Hitler looking for relics,
oh my gosh, yes,
and trying to steal the natural or the supernatural properties from them.
Right.
And yeah, you're right. It's a whole nother podcast we could do on.
But you're right.
Yeah, and it's crazy, and that it's good to nip that in the bud.
Yeah.
Like right away.
Yeah. No, it is, and it is true that as I said, this corruption in practice, that is what people identify with when they think about the Catholic Church and relics. That's often the first thing that comes to mind is the abuse. And fortunately, across 2,000 years of church history, that's only a very small part of the story of relics. So you're right. But when you talk about a rabbit's foot, that sort of brings something else to mind, is that actually venerating relics and asking God for a miracle, or asking for whatever favor or need that you have, is actually the inverse of magic. I mean, magic is to take something that is physical and expect it to achieve a supernatural effect. And what Christianity has always taught is that it is a supernatural effect that comes to us through physical means. That it's not that we are doing something to change the supernatural. The supernatural comes to us because God infused himself with his creation, the Incarnation.
That's
right. Yeah. And this kind of leads to the next question, because I these are like some things that I think have to be answered too. As a historian and somebody that studies history all the time, correlation doesn't always mean causation, right? And
rarely does it ever mean causation,
right. But people are going to ask this too, because I don't know what it is about the 20th century mindset that thinks everybody's borrowing from somebody, instead of like looking at the idea of common practices throughout different cultures, right? So, a lot of people are going to ask, well, don't Christians do this because the pagans, they're basically doing what the pagans did. This is a pagan practice of antiquity. So like, aren't the Catholics just adopting these pagan practices?
Well, in order to answer that, I think, again, we have to go back to Christian theology. I don't know any mainstream Christian who can doubt the Incarnation, because if you do, then you're really not a Christian. So if you begin with that premise that, again, God chose to enter his physical creation, the very entry of him into his physical creation means that everything around us has this remarkable grace associated with it. And that, to me, is again the inverse of paganism. In paganism, there is a look toward physical matter as being the source itself. And we know that's not true. We know that the physical matter is the creation of an omnipotent creator who chose to be one of us. And so I think that's very different. I know that's probably maybe perhaps a common, I've not heard that one before, but apparently in some quarters it might be. I don't even see a connect there.
Out of curiosity, just sort of in general, do you know sort of the history of like the pagan kind of use of relics compared to Christianity, besides that fundamental doctrinal difference? Like, what are some of the similarities and differences in the historical development between the two?
Well, pagan is a pretty broad term. So, I mean, when in history are we talking about pagans? Are we talking about pagans of the Roman Empire? Are we talking about the pagans of the ancient Celtic world? I mean, there's a commonality in that, again, For many pagan cultures, there is the notion that change can be affected through something physical. Okay. Without the understanding that the physical is not the source. It's not the source. The source of all power to achieve anything in this life is divine. And the fact that Christians choose to use, or some Christians choose, to use physical remains as a way to contemplate and meditate upon the divine and that great mystery of the Incarnation is not only not weird, it was common Christian practice, well, for all of us for 1,500 years, for some of us for now over 2,000 years. So again, it's the inverse. It's that paganism leaves out that element that there is a force at work through the physical, and not that the physical itself can achieve an effect. If that, again, I'm not sure that I don't feel like I'm making that point, but
no, I think you are. Yeah,
yeah.
no, I totally get it. Because you know, and you're right to call out paganism as a broad term, because you know, yeah, the Norse people would probably try to find the spear of Odin, but like you know, you have the Egyptians who may not have anything, you know, except for their mummies, you know, and stuff like that. With, you know, so I mean, you have to kind of like, you know, I guess specify, you know, what culture, like you said, what is it, Romans and this and that, and then you got to think on top of it, is this what the person's really asking? Because they're just got it in their head, probably from some meme they picked up on the internet, and they're like, okay, pagans did this, so Christians stole from the pagans, and that's what we deal with all the time, especially with people from the anti-holiday crowd, you know, and it connects. So no, I think your point is well made. I think it's a little creepy, but then again, the people back then, they dealt with death on a daily basis. They were shielded from a lot of stuff that our ancestors are you know, saw every day, and may have had a different mindset on it.
Yeah, and you know, when you say the word creepy, you kind of have to chuckle about that, because I think it's something that the ancient world, and certainly the earliest Christians, understood that we do not. You kind of alluded to this, and that is that that it really, what it really says is that the human form is beautiful, and it is part of God's great creation, and it actually honors human life rather than looking at it as something that is creepy or weird. Because remember that if we say that a relic, the meaning of the word is something that is left behind, what we have already said is that something has therefore gone before it. Something has gone on. If something is left behind, something has gone on. So we're also really making a statement about eternal life. I mean, there's really all kinds of beautiful aspects to this that are philosophical, but certainly to the earliest Christians, it wasn't weird at all. And I think a couple of things. I think the Protestant movement, I think the advent of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century that denied miracles. I mean, who can forget that Jefferson cut all those passages out of his Bible that he didn't think Jesus did because they were unreasonable. So I do think that we are living the intellectual legacy of those two great movements of the recent past. And we've lost that purview that the earliest Christians had. You know, they were living it.
Oh yeah. It's very interesting to see the, you know, the shift of mindset, which we also could think too, you know, we're shielded from death too on a daily basis and stuff like that. So, you know, that whole mindset would shift. But I'll kick it back to Dale. I thought that was a great answer. So yeah, I didn't miss a beat. Dale, did you?
No. And I loved your transition into asking about, you know, people that do think it's creepy, and getting sort of Cheryl's response to that. That was one of the questions Cheryl definitely wanted to ask, because it's a common sentiment today, right? We're so different from like people, the way they thought back in the medieval period and in early Christianity and stuff like that. So, All right. Yeah, I guess I'll transition. We've been kind of speaking about relics in the abstract for the most part. I think you've given some specifics, but I just want to turn it to you at this point. And do you want to provide some specific examples that you think are particularly important, and maybe provide some kind of history as associated to their authentication and that sort of thing?
Well, I suppose we could begin with saints that we know. Obviously, we know where their remains are. There are many, many churches in the world that house relics of various saints. The process of authenticating a relic has become ever more rigorous, by the way. You can imagine after some of the kerfluffle of the Middle Ages that the church would be more intent about that. Actually, following the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the great Reform Council of the church, there was a lot more rigor applied to the process of authenticating relics. So, for instance, I mean, John the Baptist has 3 heads. He does. I mean, there's 3 different churches in the world that claim to have the head of John the Baptist. That doesn't help the cause of relics, okay? But what it does tell me is that John the Baptist is someone that the Christian community obviously venerated, honored, looked to, who wouldn't be proud to have him as a patron of their church. So that raises the other issue of authenticity, which I want to speak about separately, okay? But you know, there are, of course, what we call first class, second class, and third class relics. So a first class relic is something that was a physical remain of a specific individual, okay? A second class relic would be something that they owned or touched or held or kept, like a prayer book or a rosary, or something that belonged to that person as a personal possession, okay? Something that is touched to the remain of a saint is a second class relic, okay? And then you can get into other degrees of relics, and the church doesn't really recognize anything past second class relics anyway. So first class relics, for instance, all the instruments of the Passion are first class relics. Jesus didn't leave any physical remains. If you're a Christian, you know that. You know that he didn't leave any body parts behind.
Mhm.
So any instrument of the Passion that is associated with that is a first class relic. The shroud, for instance, would be a first class relic. The nails, the true cross, all of those things that raise the suspicion index of authenticity for good reason are first class relics. So to the issue of authenticity, and I always have to be careful how I say this, because it never really comes out the way I intend for it to. So I'm just going to go with it, and you can ask me for clarification. When it comes to someone's personal piety, and this is something that I observe in studying the Middle Ages, when it comes to someone's personal piety, their personal religiosity, what it is that connects them to the divine, I'm not sure that authenticity is an issue. And I want to clarify that by saying that I'm not saying that it's not important that we be rigorous about authenticating. What I'm saying is that because we know it's not the relic itself, but the contemplation of what it represents and where it came from, there's a deep theological issue at stake there that authenticity doesn't really answer. I don't know if that helped, if that even really makes sense, but you know, but for instance, it's a common thing. You know, I've heard this many, many times in the 25 years I've been teaching Christian church history. I hear this all, and I'm in the Bible Belt. Okay, so I hear this all the time. Well, there's enough pieces of the true cross to build a battleship. You know, have you ever heard that?
Yeah.
No, there's not. No, there's not. It is a very common misunderstanding that because every cathedral in the Catholic world has a tiny piece of the true cross, going back to the time of St. Helena's great expedition to the Holy Land in the 4th century, there's this misunderstanding that because of the abuse of relics, that we've got, like, you know, a whole battleship of crosses. And the truth is, if you put every piece of the true cross together, you don't have enough to make one cross. much less a battleship. And so I'm always struck by these blanket kind of dismissals of something that this was the most important event in history if you are a Christian. Why would you think and assume and just blatantly deny that early Christians would not have wanted to preserve those things? That makes no sense. It's counter to human nature. So, again, we have the human element of corruption in this, and that's unfortunate. But I don't think we can dismiss the authenticity just because we think it implausible.
Gotcha. Okay. So just to clarify, so there was something that was new to me. So there's these 3 classes of relic.
Right.
So first class would refer to actual body parts of the saint or something.
The actual physical remains. That's right.
Okay. And then second class is stuff that was associated with that saint or touched the body part after the remains after. And what was the third class? I know you said
a third class relic. You can actually go into all kind of classes, 3rd, 4th, 5th, whatever. If you can say a third class relic is something that was touched to a second class relic. The church does not, and we speak about this in classes because many people refer popularly to third class relics, when in fact the church does not even really recognize third class relics. They recognize first and second class relics. So I use that as an example because many people, there's a disconnect in people's own understanding and practice. I mean, I know Catholics who would speak of, it's a third class relic, not knowing that the church really doesn't teach that. So it is a common misrepresentation. First and second class relics. And all instruments of the Passion, as I said, are first class relics.
Yeah, I definitely.
That's
interesting. So yeah, I didn't know that. So all right, that's awesome. David, do you have any sort of follow-up questions about this issue here?
Well, Dale, since your the actual next question is kind of linked to this, so I'll let you figure out how you want to ask it since it's been part of your question anyway. So yeah, I'll let you follow up with that. I find it fascinating. It really is. And I can't wait to see what relics that you've studied, Miss White. So yeah, Dale, I'll let you ask that follow-up.
All right, cool. So yeah, so you've kind of been answering for the most part, like, the theological standards for identifying and authenticating relics and what kind of significance they have theologically, how we classify them and that sort of thing. But I'm just wondering like how those standards integrate or complement your understanding as a professional historian, or do you find they contradict? Like, do you have cognitive dissonance? Like, how do you reconcile your standards as a professional historian with your theological standards as a Catholic in terms of authenticating that?
Right. So that's kind of been the beautiful part of my personal journey, is that there is no cognitive dissonance, as you say. I love that word, that term, but there is none for me because I do have this understanding. Again, if you look at the Middle Ages, which is what I've spent my life studying, and you see that the people of that era had remarkable piety. I mean, sometimes, the type that the modern and postmodern world clearly does not understand. When you read these chronicles of people receiving into their village, for instance, the translation of a relic of a saint from somewhere else that's coming to visit their to visit their monastery or their church, and they would have these all-night vigils and great feast and great celebrations, and the whole community came together in this expression of piety and honoring the model of the life of this person. That's where, to me, the rubber meets the road, so to speak. It's the ability of physical remains to bring to in a very visible, tangible way those supernatural, metaphysical principles that Christians share. So if there is an abuse in that practice, and we know there was, if there is wholesale trade in that, when you could go into a pasture in the 12th century and pick up the bone of a cow and pass it off as the femur of a saint, because that they don't call it medieval ignorance for nothing, right?
Mhm.
When an age can do that and yet produce this incredible devotion, personal practices of devotion that the postmodern and postmodern world and all of our science we have lost, I don't have any dissonance about that. To me, that's the beauty of the veneration of relics, is that it is profound devotion. So whether they're authentic, whether they were stolen, whether they were picked up in the local pasture and passed off as the femur of the local saint, I mean, it's the beauty of the devotion that speaks to me and always has. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, very interesting. All right. I'm looking at the next question. I know that we've talked a lot about the next question. I'll turn it to David, but like maybe when you're answering it, just if there's something related to it that you haven't brought up or something, or that you think is important. But yeah, David, go ahead and ask question 9.
Yeah, I was already reforming the question as she was giving,
Oh, were you?
giving the
Okay.
answer. Yeah. So
David's a smooth host, and I'm just not. I don't have the charm. That's why I bring.
I try to make the broadcast go smooth. But yeah, you've already started explaining some of these abuses that went on in the Middle Ages and stuff like that. First and foremost, I'd love to hear what you studied, what relics you've actually been able to study and see and stuff like that. That would be really fascinating. Maybe you could start with that and then go into these abuses and tell us what kind of abuses maybe they were. Like you already mentioned, a femur from the pasture. I thought that was kind of funny, but yeah, maybe give us some specifics of what those abuses were, and just give us a quick I guess rundown of some of the abuses that they faced back then.
Right. So I have studied a variety of relics, but my interest is primarily centered on passion relics. I have a great interest in the true cross. I have a great interest in something called the Titulus Crucis, or the sign of the title of the cross, which has a very interesting spurious history, and interested in the crown of thorns, the nails, all of those things that are associated with the passion, including, of course, the shroud, which is what I've dedicated 30 years of my life to. So some of the abuses that I'm sort of referring to is that in order for a new church to be consecrated, as I said, after the 8th century, there had to be the relic. They had to have a relic of a saint. It's specified this is still true today. It's specified in the Council of Second Nicaea that there could be no new churches dedicated without the relic of a saint. So what begins to happen by the High Middle Ages is, if any bone will do, any bone will do. And I do think that happened. I also think that there were relics passed off as pieces of the true cross, for instance, that were not. There are people who own pieces of what they think is the crown of thorns. And when you test the different pieces that we know to exist, some of them are not even the same species of plant. And so what that does for me is bring more sharply into focus that theological element behind it, but also it points to there being somewhere, there is an authentic thorn from the crown of thorns. There is a true cross. We know that those things happened, and we know that that the people who knew where Jesus was crucified and where they took his body, those places were never forgotten. So yeah, abuses, yes, for sure, certainly. Never more so than in the High Middle Ages.
Right on. So here's the fun question: the crown of thorns in Notre Dame, authentic or fake?
What I believe is that the I'm not dodging the question. Okay. I'm not dodging the question. What I believe is in Notre Dame Cathedral is, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's really just kind of a rush of twigs, and there are no thorns on it. because presumably throughout history, beginning with King St. Louis IX, who acquired it in the 13th century, he began breaking off pieces of it and giving it to different places. So we do have, a depository in some places that do align. They are the same species. But what is in Notre Dame Cathedral today is actually a plant that is native to Western Europe. So this is what I believe. I'm not ruling out that King St. Louis IX had the crown of thorns, but I think what he did, not understanding pollinology, or that we would ever be able to know, I think he created a base to stabilize what was left, and using a native plant to do that. Because we do have records throughout the centuries of him distributing pieces of it. So I think what's left today is that base that stabilized the original. And the pieces of the crown are scattered across Christendom. So, that's what I think.
Fascinating. Yeah, Dale, I'll switch it back to you.
All right, cool. I did think of an interesting follow-up question based on your being a professional historian and that sort of thing. So, as you'll probably know, when we're like authenticating like the minimal facts for the Jesus resurrection, people like Gary Habermas, they'll use the historical criteria of authenticity, like the criterion of embarrassment or multiple independent attestations, criteria like that. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the historical authentication of relics, do historians use those type of criteria to authenticate relics? Is it even relevant, or what's sort of that?
Well, it's really not the job of the historian to authenticate a relic. I think in many ways we have to defer to the authority on that. And certainly when we look at periods of history where we know there were abuses, I think it's quite right. I said this in my Shroud interview. I think it's quite right for us to have an index of suspicion about anything that has a historical footprint in the Middle Ages. So just because we have a record that a relic has transferred from one place to another and is purported to be St. Thomas the Apostle, for instance, who is in India, right, by tradition. Just because we have the record doesn't speak to the authenticity. So I think we have to leave that, history being the written record, I think we have to leave that to another authority to determine that. And we can use our index of suspicion always in a healthy way.
Gotcha. All right, cool. All right, so the last question, so I've been trying to think of how, because I think you kind of addressed the last question in terms of question 10 with the different classes of relics. So I was just going to say, how do relics relate to other types of things? Like splinters from the cross. You've already kind of answered that, but are there other types of other objects of reverence or veneration that aren't classed as relics? And what are the differences between that, or are they all considered relics?
For veneration, no. I mean, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there is a practice of venerating icons. But I don't know much about that practice. I am primarily a student of Western Christianity, so I can't think of anything. I mean, we're talking about relics, we're talking about physical remains anyway, so physical objects.
Gotcha. Okay. There's just the relics kind of thing. So
okay. So let me touch on something. I think that I may know where you were going with that. So for instance, in traditional Christianity, historical Christianity, there's the practice of there's piety, for instance, in approaching a tabernacle, where we know that in Catholic teaching, of course, we believe in the real presence of Christ, that he is physically present in the Eucharist. And so there is a practice of venerating, right, of adoring a tabernacle is to genuflect before it, to make the sign of a cross before a crucifix. I mean, these are, again, patterns of personal piety that speak to our understanding of what that crucifix represents. It's not that Jesus is there, it's that he was. And it's a way of marking, in a physical way, again, in a tangible physical way, we are marking with our bodies the wholeness of the Christian message. And so maybe you were speaking about things like that, practices that are directed toward objects.
Or statues, for example, that have
No,
never.
and I, sometimes you'll see people. I see this all the time. People kiss statues, or they'll kiss their fingers and touch a statue. And again, it's a way of using the physical body to embrace the message of the faith, and to pay honor to whoever that statue represents. It's not the physical remain they're venerating, but as a representation of that. The Holy Family, you see that a lot with Mary and Joseph and Jesus. You see that a lot. So,
Gotcha. Cool. All right, David. Yeah, I'll turn it to you to close us off. I think that covers all the questions.
yeah, and I'm going to have to jump off actually because I've got another meeting.
Oh, no problem. Okay. Well, yeah. In that case, thank you. Well, we'll end it here then. So, yeah, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed your time. And
this was great, guys. Thanks for the great questions. These were super questions, by the way.
Thank you.
These are really good questions.
Thank you for coming on and answering them. It's good to have somebody that knows a lot about the subject to be able to form those questions and answer those questions. So we appreciate
Hopefully
you
it'll
coming
give
on.
your listeners maybe something to think about. So, it's if we could do anything to break down some of the divide between Christian groups, I think that's important. And it's only done through education, so thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yep.
welcome. Yeah, that's what Real Seekers is all about. So awesome.
There you go.
There you go. All right,
Thanks,
cool.
Dale.
No problem, Cheryl. Have a great one. And just for the audience before everyone goes, next week we have Robin Dykstra talking about, she's got a new book about how she was a former Playboy bunny. Now she's turned into a Christian. So we're going to be going through that and how that happened. So other than that, have a great week, everybody.